discussing the press radio war of the 1930s. On November 2nd, 1920, station KDKA made the nation's first radio broadcast. Well, kind of. KDKA was technically not the only radio station at the time, but it is certainly considered a model first by many. Within 2 years, just about 600 radio stations had sprung up around the United States, and by 1933, it had already become a seeming threat to print journalists. See, radio broadcast stations hadn't really explored their prowess with news just yet. Early on, they started off simply reading newspaper headlines over the air. Print journalists even aided radio stations by promoting their work on their writing. However, radio broadcast companies eventually then began to purchase their news stories directly from wire services, and it changed the game. Print journalists quickly came to worry about maintaining their status of importance in the news market. They feared losing relevancy. As a result, journalists banded together, and in April of 1933, all wire services agreed to no longer sell content to radio stations for broadcasting. Their plan was basically to choke out broadcast radio news by depriving them of new material. This, of course, did make it more difficult, but it did not end their careers as intended, because while they couldn't get new material, simply having not as easy access to news stories, it made them get resourceful. Radio broadcasters began to become more self-sufficient, and it led to companies such as CBS and NBC creating their own full news divisions and paving the way for networks much like them to be more independent and less intrusive to print journalists. Still, print journalists were not satisfied and decided to take further measures, varying from political lobbying to economic boycotts and even legal action. These measures did slow down radio broadcast production of news, but not for long. Print journalists failed to find the long-term impacts they sought, so they finally decided to try and negotiate a truce with radio broadcast companies. While they did come to an agreement, it fell through almost immediately. Broadcast companies were meant to air only twice a day and at times that were non-conflicting to prime newspaper sales, and the issues discussed could not be breaking either. Broadcast companies agreed, but they found too many loopholes. They began to set up commentary personalities on air, but found ways of slipping news updates into their segments. Not only that, but because independent broadcasters refused to sign the assignment, over 450 radio stations were not being held to the agreement standards. Relations between radio broadcast companies and print journalists for newspapers during this time was jaded, and their fight for relevancy was brutal. But it was brought to a seeming halt by an even bigger fight, World War II. Shortly after World War II started in 1939, and it was a prime showcase for the coverage that radio broadcast news had to offer in the world of newscasting, which allowed it to flourish in a mainstream source of current events.